Good morning. Runners. These are LeBrons. They're my son Carter's. He's very proud of them, and he told me I could only use them this morning if I took really good care of them. My name is Carolyn Klassen, and I have and continue to spend many hours sitting on the bleachers watching my kids play volleyball, basketball, badminton, soccer, hockey, and so on. They love to play, and I love to watch them play. My kids are really competitive, and they do whatever they can to play their best. I just love to watch them strive for excellence, usually. However, our oldest, Adam, had a strategy to play better that I just couldn't stand as his mother. When he was playing, he had this nasty strategy of licking his whole hand and wiping the bottom of his shoe, like that. It was disgusting. He said he could get better grip if the surface was a wee bit damp, and it would freshen up the tread to make sure that he had more traction, and then he could play better. Sometimes he would wash the bottom of his shoes 3 and 4 times in between plays. Yeah. I didn't think it gave him better grip so much as exposed him to every single germ that was in the gym. He wasn't interested in my opinion, and so this went on for years. I can only assume that it contributed to a stronger immune system. Though I would maintain that it was misguided, Adam's strategies to ensure that he had maximum grip on the bottom of his court shoes came from a fundamental understanding that he and I would both agree on. Secure and stable grounding is important, not only in the gym. Secure and stable grounding is important in all of life. These are my shoes. These are usually my work shoes in most of the seasons. I wear them when I do therapy with clients. There is a term in therapy that we use where we say that in order for a client to do good work, they need to be grounded. They need to be solidly based in reality, right here, right now. Because sometimes clients get all up in their head, where they might start to panic at all the things that might happen. They spin into the anxiety of terrible possibilities, and then they get anxious about the anxiety, and then they are anxious that they are anxious about the anxiety, and so on. And some of you are laughing because you know that you've been there and you know what I'm talking about. Other times, a client might get lost in painful trauma. The memories are not acting as memories. They start acting as real right now. I can see them start to get less grounded as they get lost in past experiences of terrible pain, and they lose touch that in this moment, they are in the safe space of a therapy session. In those moments, a client is less solid in reality, in the right here, right now. In those moments, a therapist like myself will stop them from spinning in their fear and panic, and we'll do something called grounding work. I'm going to give you a sample of what this looks like. Make yourselves comfortable. And what I want you to do is I want you to wiggle your toes in your shoes or against your sandals. And I really want you to feel what it's like to have your toes in your shoes. Notice the sensation of your toes against your sandals or in your shoes. Right now. And then I want you to rub your feet on the carpet and feel what this carpet feels like under your shoes. Notice the texture of this carpet right now. Now wiggle your butt against the chair. Feel the chair underneath you. See if you can shift your weight from one cheek to the other. And then see if you can balance yourself equally on both sides so that you're in the middle. Balance your body centered on the chair. Put yourself very firmly into this room. Look around. See and notice the colors and shapes. Let your eyes settle on something that catches it. It might be something on the wall. It might be the person in front of you. maybe something about me, notice the color and shape. Really look at it to notice everything you can about it. And now, take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, slightly pursed. Focus on your lungs filling with air and feel the clean air come in, and then listen to the sound of it coming out. For some of you, even that tiny bit of grounding work focused you. It relaxed you. And it took you out of your preoccupied, busy head that's all over and lowered your heart rate because it brought you right here into this room right now so you can concentrate better. Grounding is something that's important to do. In a session, if a client isn't firmly grounded in the reality of the room and in our conversation, we aren't in the real. And when a client isn't fully present, they can't do their best work. These are soccer cleats. They're gyms. I don't know if you can see, but there's bumps on them. And I brought soccer shoes because I couldn't get a pair of Roman centurion sandals. They're all about 2,000 years old, and I couldn't find any. So I brought these. Today, we're going to be continuing the series on the armor of God. Last week, Sarah talked about the breastplate of righteousness, and the week before that, we talked about the belt of truth. Today, we are talking about shoes, looking at how the gospel of peace prepares our feet for what life might throw at us. And the shoes that Paul is referring to, that his readers brought to mind when they read his letter, were the footwear that Roman centurions wore. These were sandals that had long strips that were wrapped around a couple of times around the calves and tied at the top. Some of them would have a metal strip down the front of the leg to protect the leg from weapons. But the thing that I want to point out this morning is that Roman soldiers had sandals with short spikes on their soles, kind of like these soccer cleats. The soles of these sandals more than just protected his feet from ground, they actually gave him better grip. A soldier was able to better stand up and do what needed to get done when he had sure footing. These shoes grounded him. They made him firm so that he could do his work. A soldier wasn't easily tripping, sliding, getting pushed around. His feet were solidly grounded. Hold that thought. So we're going to look over our text this morning, and I'm going to invite you to turn to Ephesians 6. And if you have one of the Bibles in the back, then you're going to turn to page 1177. We've been working on Ephesians for months, and today we're going to be looking at Ephesians 6 as we have the last couple of weeks again, and I'm going to start at verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. After you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet firmly fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Feet firmly planted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. So I've been thinking a lot lately about how the gospel of peace readies us to be a people of peace. Thinking about how the gospel of peace prepares us to stand up against evil, the evil in this world that we can't see but so exists, the evil that resides within us and between us, the evil that is within the systems of our world and also within the conversations around our dinner table. Let me start by saying that as a therapist, I know there is a very big difference between no active conflict and peace. I have a job because many people try to fool themselves into believing that if there is no act of fighting, things are fine. This is a fantasy that we all wish was true. If we push it away and pay the ugly no mind, it won't exist, and with time it will go away. If that worked, it would be great. But pushing away the disagreements and anger backstage just means that instead of dealing with it, it pulls on us like strings on a puppet. It controls situations in ways that might not be easily visible, but are very, very powerful. I've been known to live out of that fantasy as well. There may have been a parenting time or 2 or 18 when my kids were younger and they would be poking at each other endlessly, and out of frustration, I would say, if you can't say something kind, don't say anything at all, in the desperate belief that it would create some peace. It may have created a few moments of silence, which was not unwelcome to this frazzled mom's heart. But I do fear that the message I was implicitly planting in my kids' hearts is that if we're not fighting, then we're all good. And we're not. There is a big difference between not fighting and living in wholeness, actually being meaningfully connected with each other. Big difference. Actually, truth be told, getting to authentic peace with each other often means uncomfortable conversations, heated moments, pain, tears, misunderstandings that need to be hashed out, holding people accountable, patiently listening when you'd rather be explaining, hurt feelings that need to be named and acknowledged, forgiving, apologizing. In short, getting to peace often involves a whole lot of messiness that doesn't really look much like peace at all when you're in the middle of it. True peace comes because of active, engaged relationships where folks are willing to dive into the crap and figure stuff out. So, if all the stuff of getting to real peace is super messy, this gets tricky, right? Many of us fear ugly arguments because, let's face it, A, we have all watched something ugly get really ugly, and it's not pretty, scary even. And B, we, or at least me, I am not at my best self when I get all worked up. And some of these messy conversations pull me off of my center. And I don't like watching unkind things coming out of my mouth in mean ways to someone I care about, in ways that actually don't represent me well. Many people tell me that the more important and the more they love a person, the uglier they find themselves being in a disagreement. Too often, it just feels safer to leave well enough alone, to stay silent, keep it zipped, and just pretend it doesn't matter, even though it does. Shane Claiborne, he's a pastor, writer, social justice advocate. He writes in his book, Common Prayer, A Liturgy for Ordinary Radicals. Peace is not about the absence of conflict. It is also about the presence of justice. Martin Luther King Jr. even distinguished between the devil's peace and God's true peace. A counterfeit peace exists when people are pacified or distracted or so beat up and tired of fighting that all seems calm. But true peace does not exist until there is justice, restoration, forgiveness. Peacemaking does not mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. It is the act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer, the act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressors free. One of the main reasons I have a job as a therapist is the profound discomfort that we all have, myself included, with the hard work of reconciliation. Many of us would rather settle for keeping an artificial peace than for wrestling to get to the real stuff. And then people come to see me when that doesn't work. I'm so passionate about it, I wrote and published a book last fall to promote active peacemaking in couples. I made the title purposely shocking and jolting. My marriage is almost dead and my husband doesn't get it. This is peacemaking with slippers on. And slippers don't have a lot of attraction, right? And often it's harder to get grounding and to be your best in peacemaking within those very close relationships. Doing the uncomfortable and messy work of making relationships actually work rather than just seeming to work. Quite possibly, this is even more awkward and frightening and painful area to work at with peace than on a larger scale. With those most important to us, it's so super vulnerable to speak up, to be engaged, to not enable another person's bad behavior, to do the difficult work of gifting others with discomfort so that the relationships can grow and be closer. In my experience, actively working on peace in relationships is often harder for women than for men. Culturally, women have been raised to make relationships work by swallowing our discomfort and staying silent. There are absolutely men who do this too, by the way, but we lie to ourselves that it doesn't matter when we are overlooked, when what is important to us is devalued, and so on, and we silently allow ourselves to be taken advantage of, sometimes even believing that this falls in line with following God. Somehow, sometimes, we as Christians think that silently watching injustice to ourselves and doing nothing about it is the will of God. When I meet women in unhappy marriages in my counseling office, far too often, when I have asked them, why don't you tell your husband about some of the pain that you have just told me? They tell me that they don't want to hurt his feelings. If the hard conversations might be unpleasant for him, they won't have them. One of the reasons I wrote the book is that while not hurting his feelings and just silently suffering is done as a noble, serving sacrifice, that's the intention, it actually eats at the foundation of the relationship and is actually not the favor that it was intended to be. Whether the spouse is aware of it or not, when one partner is miserable in the marriage, both bear the consequences. Neither is actually enjoying the rich connection of souls that marriage is designed to have. Many couples are so averse to addressing problem areas in their relationship that research says, on average, couples wait 6 years too long before they start marriage counseling. Imagine for a moment what happens when that marital ugliness has years to roll down the hill, gathering speed and increasing in size during all that time when they are pretending things aren't so bad. To repeat, whether in marriage, in a friendship, on a committee, at work, or in our city or country, peacemaking does not mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. It is the act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love. These are my sandals. I wore these shoes to a visit I had in Starbucks last week. I met with a new friend, Diane Rusin. When I thought and prayed about what I would say this morning, it felt like God was telling me that just talking about peace within our personal relationships is an incomplete conversation. We need to talk about the larger context. And in Winnipeg these days, that means talking about the relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples. Diane and I were both presenters at TEDx Winnipeg in June, and I got to know her there. She's an Indigenous leader in Winnipeg, and I wanted to learn from her. I'm someone who recognizes and hears and wants to respond to the call for better relationships after the Peace and Reconciliation Commission. But I'm rather clueless about what that looks like when it comes to actually sort of living it out. I have to tell you, I was nervous when I emailed her to talk about this. Truthfully, I didn't know how to word my email. I was scared of screwing up and seeming naive. uninformed, or worse yet, ignorant, maybe even hurtful. I fussed over this email. After asking some questions about being an ally, about unconscious bias, and so on, eventually I wrote, "What is even the right question for me to be asking you so I can get the most meaningful responses? I might have asked this all wrong, and if so, forgive me. I'm a believer in that it is better to try and then do it wrong and learn how to do it better than to not even try at all. I'm convinced that the awkward silence of well-meaning people who hold themselves back out of fear of not knowing how to do it is what slows this process of reconciliation down." So that's what I wrote. I felt really vulnerable and hesitant. But if I'm going to talk about how hard it is to actively work towards peace, I had to be willing to live it. Integrity bites sometimes. Diane is kind and funny and thoughtful, and so much of what she said was so profound, not just for developing better relationships between settlers and Indigenous peoples, but actually applies to life much broader with people at all levels. Diane said that what needed to happen was actually in the name of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truth comes before reconciliation. She said that so often people are rushing to get to the feeling of reconciliation that they forget that first, truth needs to be shared and heard. Diane reminded me that reconciliation happens when people are able to share their stories, their pain, and their perspective. We like reconciliation, and we want to get to it, but we rush to it. And when we rush it, we have actually trouble getting to it. She said that often hearing those truths is hurtful to hear. And because we don't like to be hurt, we rush right past it, and then rush past really hearing what is necessary for the other to experience reconciliation. We all find the discomfort of unhealed relationships awkward and painful, and all of us have this inherent desire to fix, to make it better. Diane reminded me about how hard it is for us to just sit with another in their pain and listen. Her experience is that often when people try to share their story of what happened during a time of injustice, it is met with anger by the listener. When we feel vulnerable, we armor up with indignation and defensiveness, and we offload that anger and become blamey. It's so not easy to really listen to someone else's experience of wounding. As a social activist, Diane has meetings with people who want to make change. People with sizable resources wanting to help solve problems. Leaders in the community ask to talk to her. People with wealth willing to invest in solutions. That's cool, right? As a self-identified brown woman, she meets with these people who, statistically, are mostly white and mostly male. As she does what she does, clearly and articulately, outlining the situation using statistics and referring to reports and research, she says that often she hears lines that are said so very admiringly to her, like, "You are so smart. Wow, you are so articulate. So incredibly well-spoken." These lines are said to be encouraging, but the speaker has no idea of the hidden insult, of the inherent unconscious racism within those words. Can you imagine one businessman saying that to another man in the middle of a meeting? I got mad on her behalf when she told me that story. I asked her how she responds. She said she usually smiles and quips, "Thank you, I'm only one of many." I'm not sure that I would be as gracious. She told me of how she has had Indigenous mentors older than her. While in university, she would meet with them, and when she was angry, they would often ask her, "Do you want to be right, or do you want to make it right? Do you want to be right, or do you want to make it right?" So true, hey? I've been trying to memorize that line for my own life. Then she told me something else that stuck with me. She says that often we try to create safe spaces where conversations can happen, What we often mean by that is we are trying to create relationships where we feel safe. She says, rather, that we need to challenge ourselves to create brave spaces. Safe spaces implies that no one has to get uncomfortable, and she is adamant that discomfort is an important stage on the way to actual peace. Each of us has tough conversations we need to have, and we need to be brave enough to move forward to have them, not knowing in advance how they will go. And think about this. We need to be willing to offend someone, because when we risk having hard conversations, we absolutely aren't always going to get it right. When we mess up, because if we're doing the courageous work of reconciliation, we will mess up. When we mess up, she says, you need to get over yourself and simply apologize, to find a way to own it and then stay present with the conversation. When other people mess up, and they will, we need to acknowledge and feel the hurt within us, but be careful to not unpack the pain and move into that space permanently. We don't have to stay stuck in the place of woundedness. We need to create a space where others can be brave with us, and we need to create the internal space inside of ourselves to handle what they bring up. Now, this is where it gets super important, and just so synced up with today's text. Diane let me know that people need to prepare themselves to have the tough conversations, to create those brave spaces, asking themselves, what do I have to do to have tough conversations? How can I get ready to forgive myself, to forgive others, and enter the uncertainty that is part of difficult conversations? She emphasized that getting into the heart space and head space for those conversations is vital. Which brings us back to grounding, to prepping ourselves, the equivalent of spikes on our shoes, prepping ourselves from the gospel of peace to better allow ourselves to live out the gospel of peace. The grounding of the gospel lets us be brave. When our souls are firmly planted in our faith, we step out to do things we couldn't do on our own, would never dare risk on our own. God, who is gracious, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in love, loves us as we are. He loves us just as much in our worst moments as our best. The grounding of the gospel lets us be kind. The gospel of Jesus reminds you that he loves others, especially the ones that are hard to love, so you can be kind. We allow others to express their pain, holding space for their pain. We want to hear their stories because we want to listen as though it is Jesus. The gospel says that we are always held by Jesus, no matter what, so that ultimately we can know that we are okay even when we don't feel okay. We can tolerate the space that uncertainty creates because even there, we know we are held by God. We can be okay even when we are not okay. We can take risks and make mistakes and move on from them because out of the good news of the gospel says that mistakes don't define us. Mistakes can't define us. Take a listen.
I was driving my Jeep like a knucklehead. I didn't have my seatbelt on at the time.
Can't afford a real car?
And this lady T-boned the Jeep, and we flipped it. I went right out the roof.
Oh, my God.
All of a sudden, I'm sitting on the asphalt. I'm like, I just flew out the roof of my Jeep. And it's upside down. Because I'm a guy, you know, there's gas in car. I'm thinking, blow up. And it didn't, but, you know, shoot. And so they fire trucks came and they towed this car away. And this lady, like her name is, well, I won't say her name. I don't want to feel bad. Oh, no, I said it in the book. Her name's Lynn. Sue me. So
Lynn's
anyway.
numbers
But she kept sending me flowers all the time. She would call me up and said, like, you know, I'm so sorry. I'd be like in a deposition. I'd get a phone call. I'd be like, hello, it's Bob. I'm like, I'm so sorry. And Lynn, it's all good. And actually, I send her a huge bouquet of flowers.
See?
And
You can do it.
I sent it to her with a note that said, it was great running into you. Now stop calling me. But you know what? Lynn just couldn't believe that she was forgiven.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we can't believe.
Yeah.
We think that beating ourselves up will work better than grace, and it just doesn't. It's a lie. I mean, so just if we could just, we mess up. And then every time we mess up the worst, you know, God calls us beloved. We're calling ourselves all these other names.
He's crazy good.
Yeah, bingo. Yeah.
God calls us beloved, always, in every situation. It's so hard to remember that truth that we sang a few minutes ago. You didn't earn it, you don't deserve it, but God loves you with a reckless, never-ending, overwhelming love. When we can somehow remember that, it changes everything. We don't have to play it safe. We can get in there and get messy because we are forgiven. And when we remember that we are truly, deeply, completely forgiven for all of the ways that our brokenness spills out, then forgiving others becomes so much more possible. The only name to remember for yourselves in any difficult conversation is beloved. I promise you, if you are able to ground yourself in that reality, it will revolutionize every single difficult conversation that you find yourself in. I started off this morning talking about the importance of digging your souls into the ground to stabilize. We are finishing now remembering to ground our souls in the gospel. Grounding our souls deep into the truth gives us stability. Remembering the truth of God's love that is permanent and lasting no matter what in our lives allows us to be deeply solid and stable, able to have the most difficult conversation because we know that with Jesus, it is well with our souls. Through it all, our eyes are on him. Even when our eyes can't see, we can let go and trust in him. And my prayer is that all of us can pray today and always. It is well, all is well with my soul.
Thank you again, Carolyn, for the blessing that you are to us in how you share. So thank you for bringing us into your world. It struck me today, while you were giving us these wonderful instructions about feeling our toes in our shoes and rubbing our soles on the floor during this time, which I think was meant to give us a sense of grounding and perhaps offer us even the peace of that particular moment. This question came in. How do you find peace when you've betrayed your partner's trust without telling them what you've done? Should I keep what I did from them or open up to them and tell them? Opening and telling them would ruin our relationship, and he's been my rock through my sobriety and recovery. How do I find peace within myself?
That gives you a bit of sense of some of the burdens that people come into this room with, right? The heaviness that people carry, not just as she asks that question, but all the time. The problem with secrets is that not telling them saves the other person from hurt, but also affects the relationship whether you like it or not. And so secrets are hard to keep. Often exposing that secret then sometimes feels better for the person who's telling the secret, but then puts the burden on the person who has just heard it, and that's really hard. And then there's a huge process, and the relationship is never the same. But interestingly, often it doesn't ruin the relationship. Often when you tell a secret, after time of struggle, it transforms into a new relationship. The old relationship is gone and a new relationship emerges as you're able to hold and listen and work through it patiently in most situations. But I think people have to understand, I don't know that particular person, I don't know what the situation is. But often working through those secrets is painfully hard, and yet something beautiful can rise up out of the ashes, and we know that God makes beauty out of ashes. And to be involved in that work is so cool.
You clearly made reference to the scripture and this idea of being grounded in faith. And then this last song that we sang was very much also about this idea that we are to find this groundedness in our faith. There were a lot of questions about that and what the difference is between doing it with faith and without, and clearly you're a person of faith. Could you give us a glimpse into some of your very own personal practices? How does the Holy Spirit ground you in the peace that you speak of?
Okay, so I love that whole idea about being okay even when you're not okay. And what's interesting is last night, I would ordinarily, when I am teaching in the morning, I would ordinarily run through my material a couple of times just to prepare myself for this morning. I didn't get to do that last night because in our conversations, we had several hours of very difficult conversations. And so I couldn't prepare for this morning in the way I would have liked. But what was really interesting was preparing for this morning prepared me for that conversation yesterday, where I could take a deep breath and I could, instead of saying, "That's not what you just said was wrong," I could say, "Oh, okay, where does that come from?" Or "There's more to that," or "I don't think you got up in the morning intending to hurt, so like what was behind that?" And I found myself better able to, because I had spent so much time in this text and thinking about grounding, I grounded myself in that conversation. And I did not do it perfectly, and I'll have to go back and apologize for the things where I didn't have my best self, for sure. But even the preparation allows me to go back and do the forgiving, right? But I feel like I could do that conversation differently because I had grounded myself. And when somebody says something mean and nasty, I can go, "Oh, well, that hurts, but that doesn't change who I am in Christ. I am still beloved, so I can take that attack and be curious about it rather than judgmental." And I'm making it sound easier than it is, but it's very deliberate practice in the moment when I have my own difficult conversations, and I'm just as human as anybody else when it's somebody close to me.
Okay, thank you for giving us a glimpse. Again, thank you for sharing. There were way more questions than I could possibly have brought to your attention, obviously. But thank you for giving us the insight that you have.
Thanks, Pastor Bob. So when my oldest, Adam, was in elementary school, we had to walk a block where he got the school bus. And I had Carter, a little preschooler at the time, who thought it was really dumb to have to put on all his winter stuff to walk the block and back. And so we were often running late because to get this kid into his stuff was such a pain. And so we would be walking him to the block and the school bus would already be there. And so I would tell Adam, "Hurry up, go run ahead to the bus and we'll watch from here." So the little guy would run to the bus, but then just before he got to the bus, he would run back. And he would have his arms wide open and he would do this like hug and kiss. But it wasn't just a hug and a kiss, it was like hug, kiss, hug, kiss, hug, kiss, right? And the bus is waiting and he's hug kissing me, right? And so one time I asked him, I said, "Why do we like hug and kiss a bunch of times?" And he says, "Because I need to make sure that at least one works." Aw. And I loved the idea that his grounding with me to make sure, I loved him no matter what, right? But it was that hug kiss that reminded him and grounded him in the love that I had for him and in our family, so that no matter what happened in the classroom and on the playground that day, he knew that one had worked and that would affect how he did his day. For the people of God, Sunday mornings are like hug, kiss, hug, kiss, hug, kiss. Maybe it was a song, maybe it was a handshake or a hug. Maybe it was in what God said in the words that I said today. I want you to think for a moment about one hug kiss this morning that worked for you. One thing that will ground you as you get on the bus of life this week that you can take with you. Just think about that. This hour has been a chance to make sure that you know that it is well with your soul and to remind you of the reckless love of God that God has for you. If you would like to pray, I have someone pray with you or for you about something in your life or in a friend's life. Please come to the front. There will be prayer warriors here that want to pray together with you. Go, grounded in the height and depth and width and breadth of the love of God, and may that shape everything you do this week. Amen.